Hey guys, it's Courtney and I'm back here with another design team project for Trinity stamps. Today we're going to be using the Hello Sweet Friend stamp set and we're just going to be using that main image. I have a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock here cut down to 4¼ by 5½, as well as a piece of masking paper cut just slightly larger, as well as a stitched square die, which it doesn't need to be stitched. In fact, I prefer that it not be stitched, but that's the only one I have. So I centered the die onto my masking paper, ran that through my Gemini, and then I'll do my stamping. I'm going to bring out my Misty here because I know I'm going to be stamping this twice eventually. I just used my mask, which is kind of like a frame at this point, just as a guide as to where I want to put my image. Then I will remove that mask before I do my stamping onto the cardstock itself. And I'm going to be stamping with Blackout ink by Ink on 3 because this is a Copic safe ink. And for now, I'm just going to stamp it once, but I'm going to leave this stamp in my Misty in the same position because later on I'm going to be stamping this again. So next we're going to be doing some ink blending. So I'm going to take this little frame mask here and I'm going to rub this on my arm to kind of get rid of some of the tackiness just so it doesn't tear my paper. And then I'm just going to center that onto my cardstock. And I know my image is going to kind of hang out of this frame, and that's okay. That's kind of what I'm looking for. I'm going to be using the new Blendability brushes by Trinity, and I'm going to be using Black Soot and Hickory Smoke regular distress inks. Going to start off with the Black Soot, and I'm using one of the smaller brushes in the set for just the inside frame, just because I wanted to keep the Black Soot minimal. So I'm just going to go around the edges in a circular motion with the Black Soot, and this is the first time I'm using these brushes, and they blend beautifully and they don't it's like the ink doesn't seep into them. So if you're using multiple colors, you don't have to worry about necessarily cleaning your brush every single time you switch to a different color. If you just kind of dab it off on a scrap piece of paper, I don't think you'll have a problem. Next, I'm going to be using one of the larger brushes for the Hickory Smoke, and I'm just going to blend that Black Soot out towards the center of my little square here. Now, my Hickory Smoke is one of the smaller ink pads and it's drying up a lot and I don't have a re-inker, and I don't have any re-inkers for any of the Distress or the Distress Oxides. I've had my Distress inks for probably 6 or 7 years and I've never had to re-ink them until now. Um, but I'm just kind of working with what I have right now, and I didn't really have a problem. Like I said, these brushes really do help blend these beautifully. Next, I'll go ahead and remove my outer mask here, just being careful not to tear the paper. I did kind of remove some of the tackiness, but it is still fairly tacky, so you just want to be sure that you don't kind of tear your paper. Next, I'm going to use that square that we cut out for the inner mask, and while the Distress ink is still wet, it's not going to stick that great, but as it dries a little bit, it will stay in place anyway. So I'm going to switch over to one of the larger brushes for the Black Soot for the main part of the panel, just because this is a larger area. But again, just going around all four sides with the Black Soot. And I'm kind of working off the paper starting off on my scrap paper and kind of working my way onto the card panel, just because I don't want this to be too much. I want the Black Soot to be minimal. This is just basically my shadow, if you want to think of it that way. So once I had that Black Soot down, I will go ahead and move back to my brush that I was using for the Hickory Smoke, and I'm just going to blend that out towards the center. I am leaving a little bit of white here, so I'm not blending all the way to my inner mask there, but I'm coming pretty close. And for the corners, I'm just bringing that down a little bit further. Now you can see that in the one top right hand corner, I didn't get that great of a blend, and that's mainly because I'm running out of Hickory Smoke here. So I'm really trying to put as much ink as I possibly can onto the brush, but it's just, I would have had a better blend if I would have had a juicier ink pad, but it is what it is. So once I had all the ink blending done, I will go ahead and remove my masks, and we're going to be doing just a little bit of Copic coloring here. I did try to blend that corner out a little bit more with that Hickory Smoke, but we ended up trimming down the panel anyway, so it didn't really matter too much. So I'm just going to show you a little bit of the coloring. I used all cool grays for the entire thing. So I'm starting off with this little watering can here, and I'm going to start with the C7 as my darkest color, just putting a little bit of shading on either side as well as underneath where the leaves and the flowers are kind of hanging over it on the top. And this will be my shadow color. Whenever I use the cool grays, I always start with the darkest. Then I'll move on to the C5 and just extend those flicks out and extend those shadows out a little bit further, keeping a center highlight. Not only is this a rounder object, so you want this highlight in the center, but I'm just going to keep a center light source anyway. And then finally, I'll blend that out with the C3. And next we'll move on to some of the flowers, and I'm going to use the same three colors for them as well. And I did kind of switch this up throughout the entire image. Some of the images, mainly the flowers, my darkest color was the C7, and I used the C7, C5, and C3. And for some of the leaves and the buds, I started off with my C5 as being my darkest color and worked my way down to a C1, which is pretty similar to the light layer of the hickory smoke that we had. So it didn't necessarily show, but it blended the two colors out together. So for that first flower there, we just added a little bit of shading in on the base of the petals as well as where each of the petals are kind of folded over on themselves. And I'll show you just one more flower here just because this one's a little bit different. And I'm basically just creating a line where one petal is laying over another, or under another, I should say, with the darkest color, and then just make that line a little bit thicker with the C5, and then finally going in with the C3 and covering up the remaining part. I'm going right over the little stamen in the center at this point because we're going to go in with a white gel pen later and go over those. So we'll bring those back out, but right now I'm not worried about coloring around them. For the leaves and for some of the buds, like I said, I did shade these a little bit different starting off with the C5, but for the entire image, I used the same colors. And I'm just doing my shading on either end of the little leaf here to keep a center highlight. It'll make it look like the leaf is kind of curved a little bit. Extending that out with the C3 and then finally the C1. And like I said, I kind of colored the entire image the same way. For some of these larger leaves, for the ones that are kind of laying underneath something else, I did use the C7 just to create that shadow, mainly because it would just blend in too much with the other images or the other leaves that are hanging above it. But once my coloring was done, I'm going to go in and color in the stems. And I'm using my C7 for this, not doing any shading at all. These are really teeny tiny areas and I'm not really worried about the shading. So I'm just going to go in with my C7 and go over those areas. And next, once the coloring was finally complete, I'm going to go ahead and restamp my image. So like I said, I left that stamp right in my MISTI in that same position, going to bring out that same blackout ink and restamp my image just to get a bolder black outline. And I don't know whether you guys can tell the difference, but in real life, you can definitely tell the difference. Next, I took a Copic Safe pen and just a straight edge here and framed in that inner rectangle or square rather, just to kind of make that pop a little bit. You could have traced the mask itself, but I didn't know whether I was going to do this or not. So it's just as easy to go over it with the straight edge. Next, I'm just going to trim my panel down on all four sides just a little bit. I'm not doing any measuring here. I'm just kind of taking a little bit off of each edge. And I'm going to be using a black A2 size card base, and I'll adhere this flat with my Tambo Mono multi-glue directly to that card base, just leaving a small border of that black showing on all four sides. And next we're going to add that stamen back in with the white gel pen. So I'm going to fill in the centers of the flowers as well as those stamen that we colored over. And I'm going to create more on some of the flowers that didn't necessarily have them just to kind of make those pop out a little bit. Like I said, we used all the same colors, so sometimes they kind of blend together, or it's kind of hard to differentiate between one image and the next. So just adding a little bit of white gel pen details kind of help that out. So next we'll move on to the sentiment. Going to use that same black cardstock, treat that with my anti-static tool, and I'm going to be stamping some of the, or just the one part of the sentiment with Versamark ink and sprinkle on some white embossing powder and heat set that. And I'm going to cut this into a strip, and the remaining part of the sentiment, this stamp set has different phrases and different words that you can kind of piece together. So I'm going to stamp that directly on the card panel and then have this part popped up. So like I said, I'll cut that into a strip. Now I should have put the other part of the sentiment onto the card panel before I adhered it to the card base. So if you're going to do any heat embossing, do that before you put this onto your card base. The heat from your heat gun will kind of melt your adhesive. So sometimes you may have a problem with it coming up from the card base. So I'm going to treat that with my anti-static tools, stamp that with Versa Fine Onyx Black ink, and then bring out clear embossing powder. So this will be heat embossed with black basically, but you can use black embossing powder too. I made sure my heat gun was really heated up before I brought that to my card base because I didn't want this to come up. Popped the other part of the sentiment above that with some Scotch foam tape, and that is the card for today, guys. Thanks a lot for stopping by and have a great day. Bye.